Good morning, everyone. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
Hi. This is the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. I am John Weddleton.
Dick Trainee.
Pete Peterson.
Michelle McNulty.
Dan Coffey.
Amy DeBoski.
Christopher Constant.
Dean Davis is at the council.
You can probably go through.
Gina Ashman, interpreter.
Jamie Hartman, interpreter. Nancy Honest, clerk's office.
Brian Hart.
Tyler Robinson.
William Army, West Concourse resident.
Jeffrey from the Anchorage Downtown Partnership.
Robin Ward.
Clay Porter, architect, builder.
Hi.
Gretchen Nelson, interested citizen. Avery Wolf, interested citizen.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. So, and welcome Michelle McNulty, new planning director. For T. Starting off, we'll look at anybody have changes to the agenda? Good on this? Okay. Mom and Pop's Grocery and Liquor. We've got a couple amendments. So if we could start with Dean talking about the amendments and where they came from.
For Mom and Pops.
For Mom and Pop.
There's that. There's pages like 3 and 4.
Well, I guess there's two. So the amendment number 1 is the paragraph that adds acknowledgement of the MOU. And sure, just as we speak up community. So amendment number 1 is basically incorporating the MOU and resolution, asking for this paragraph to be added as an addition. A recommended condition for the ABC board to add to the license. And we had some dialogue working out the language with Municipal Attorney Becky and Pearson, and we ended up here. I guess the important part is the last sentence: the MOU conditions are reminding municipalities and so forth. We think that it's important to that these community councilors work and partnership with the licensee. And do what they can't find is simply in our municipality. So that's all that that's about. I think the intent, purpose, intent statement summarizes it very well. There were any questions about that one?
Well, if I might, it's not really questions, Mr. Coffey. If you look at the MOU that everybody signed, the last one of the terms was that the assembly shall conduct a meeting or something along those lines at a certain time. And so we respect the notion that the MOU is to be incorporated. In fact, we want that, but we aren't interested, I think, in having community councils or interested groups dictating to us what we shall or shall not do.
Understood.
So that's kind of the gist is we have the MOU as a requirement, but we won't be bound by the terms.
No, I understand, but of course, what our perspective is that there's 10 liquor stores in this Midtown district.
Right.
And so we don't want to be the only one who is,
Right.
Who has these conditions based on it. We believe it should be, we believe and we request that it be done area-wide,
Right.
and that we then, and I can assure you that we're all working now together to make sure that is monitored in a fashion that determines whether or not it's working.
Right, and
That
so
would really help.
one last follow-up on that. I had asked the community council and Mr. Coffey to, at the same time they did their amended resolution or MOU, to take out that language that was specific to other operators, anyone who's not one of the parties, and come up with a resolution requesting the assembly act on an area-wide basis with some restrictions. And in that way, we would have a request from the community to do that action. And so it hasn't come forward yet, but
I didn't do those, but I'm sorry, I thought I thought Mr. Potter filed both of those.
I haven't seen the second one.
Well, I'm sorry, because I got copies from Ms. Honest this morning.
Is
or
that,
yesterday.
is this specific?
It
to
isn't,
mom and pop?
right, and so what I basically want to divide those issues from this licensee and then the general process.
And
so,
where we are now, they're divided.
yes,
But just for the record, Suzanne LaFrance is the right.
so that's the gist of that one.
Okay, so that's a separate issue for mom and pops at this point, right?
Yes.
Looking area-wide.
Yes, but it's out of the memorandum of understanding that we have signed with the Midtown Community Council does not, it includes the restrictions, and the resolution that I just got does not have those restrictions. It requests that you take some action along these lines, the new one.
Right, and it's just item 5 on the last page of the first MOU is the Assembly shall schedule a hearing to evaluate effectiveness of limitations. And so
Yeah,
that's
that's all gone.
the only one, and so no, that's in there, but we've addressed it. So that's
Okay.
the First Amendment.
I think for clarification, while paragraph 5 asks the Assembly to review conditions of having working in the MOU within 3 months, the resolution that the Assembly for the Assembly, the way it's drafted, it doesn't talk about coming back in 3 months at all. I think that I have some reservations about inserting something like that, to bring that back in 3 months. I think it's perfectly fine for the licensee, community council, to review in 3 months how it's working, perhaps report to the assembly, but not the assembly to hold up the license renewal protest and condition recommendation process for an additional 3 months. The statutory framework basically is supposed to work within a 90-day window, 90-day time frame overall for a renewal. And if we're asking for another 90 days, it's definitely something that's not really provided for in state law. So I think that would be pushing the limits of arbitrary, reasonable, and so forth. So I wouldn't recommend holding the Assembly's lifted our protest. We've still got an active protest. This is our plan of action. I don't think we should hold it on for the additional 3 months.
Well,
but I do think that whatever the community council and the licensee report back to the Assembly eventually will be reflected when this license comes up again for renewal, or there is a mid-year for the 2-year license framework and statute where the Assembly can report that there's been violations and so forth. So while these conditions may not be violations, the community council is watching closely. They can report violations for January, and Assembly can ask ABC to take some action against the license. But I don't think we should include a 3-month review before the Assembly hold the whole process for that long. So that's my perspective.
And we don't disagree with that. The 3 months came because my client is required to, he's joined the community council. He's required to come to the next 3 months meetings and talk to them. And I've advised him, just keep going, don't stop after 3 months. So the 3 months came up for that reason. And the desire, of course, is not to be the only one out there that gets these restrictions placed on them, because it's not going to make any difference. If everybody else is selling shooters for $1 and we're doing it at $1.70, we're not going to sell any shooters, and you're not going to have any impact on the problem. So that's the reason, and we needed that. And number 2, I wanted to stress what I think we told you all last time, was that the conditional use process is also available to you. I do not believe to take action on a conditional use, you're required to wait till the renewal time of the ABC board's processes. So that's two things that are in the opportunity for you guys to regulate, as I understand the law.
Okay. Let me, Pete?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, looking at the last sentence, the way I'm reading this, that we are sort of making an exception. This is a one-time deal, so to speak, with Mom and Pop's Grocery, because it says it's not binding in effect of the Assembly. And so that does put your client in a little bit of a competitive disadvantage. But I would imagine the Midtown Community Council would like to see majority of the other liquor stores follow this the same pricing pattern so that they could possibly eliminate some of the, say, misuse of these products in their neighborhoods. If I'm reading this right.
Very much would like to see
Okay, let me, Forrest?
Yeah, so it seems like there were kind of two issues being discussed here. So the
Yeah.
one that there's this sort of broader principle that I think Mr. Constant brought up, which I agree with, which is that we can't have community council binding the assembly to action. And that's what this amendment is intended to address. Incidentally, it also, I believe, relates to the particular portion that has the 3-month rule. Is that right? 3 months for review, and that was the concern that Mr. Gates brought up. So I guess my question is, does this amendment also satisfy your concern, Mr. Gates, or do we need an additional amendment when it comes to the timing of the 3 months?
This satisfies my concern because the last sentence that it's not binding.
Right.
And I guess I would be concerned that Tuesday night, and somebody never wants to make another amendment, then come back in 3 months. That I would not recommend that.
Okay, so this amendment both satisfies our broader concerns and your specific concerns from the 3 months, and you're just trying to head us off the pass if we can do something dumb, which is admirable.
Happens a lot.
Okay, thanks. I think, Dick, did you have a comment?
Just that I attend this community council, so I'll be noticing if the individual comes to the community council meeting. I've been there before when he's said, I didn't even know I had to go to them. So I appreciate you, Dan, getting with him and helping him understand how important it is to show up to these community council meetings. But quite frankly, Midtown's got more liquor stores than knows what to do with. And my concern, just off the record, is with Sears. If Cars takes that over, Cars will put a liquor store there, and I'm going to do whatever I can to stop that from happening. Because I do not want them heading more liquor out to people begging money on the street corner there. Just to let you know.
Amy?
So Dean, I talked to Becky about a concern that I have. It was similar to what Mr. Constant said, but there's this real concern that I have, and we've had substantive discussions about this in the past, that with these memorandums of understandings between community councils and pot shops or liquor stores or whomever, the Assembly cannot and should not be delegating their authority of negotiation for conditions or to community councils. And Becky agreed with me on that. Does this also satisfy that by that last sentence?
Yes, that's correct. And that last sentence kind of embodies the whole principle
Okay.
that we wanted to be discussed.
Okay, thank you.
Francis?
Yeah, so I just can't leave one thing go unchallenged. So the Midtown Community Council expressed there was problems with one operator, and now, this idea that the Assembly would change the regulations for all liquor stores across the community, you could see how, Ms. Dabowski explained that the Brown Jug and Eagle River, new rules for them, say, limiting what they can sell, the business they can do when they don't have the problem. And so the Assembly has to, think about this question, whether or not they want to deal with the operator who's experiencing the problem, or to make new rules that apply to all operators. I just have to make that point.
No, thanks. I think right now we're focusing just on mom and pops, and we're focusing briefly because we don't want to take time away from the ADUs. Dean? Dean?
Yeah, I guess the 2 points. So Mr. Coffey mentions that we have a conditional use process as well, which is true, except that's not before us right now. We just have this resolution about the renewal application. So if someone were to bring conditional use modification before this, and we would address it then, perhaps it might that be done. I wouldn't say for ADUs, it probably say for health support. So you would want to have some basis to make a modification. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is we have mentioned that area-wide restrictions on container sales and things like that. At the last county meeting, we discussed not area-wide restrictions, but focusing on geographic areas that are problematic. Yeah, like Dick is mentioning, in Midtown, there's many issues in liquor stores, perhaps municipal restrictions within certain zones. I think that's what you were getting at in some of the previous drafts of the MOU. But so we do have a project that the Assembly and I will be looking at in in terms of amending Title 10 of the municipal code to allow some area restrictions on container sizes. We already had that for the downtown area in code, and so we will get doing that to enable, I guess, somebody to look at whether there's problem areas, being able to impose operation restrictions on sales and containers and stuff like that. So that's a different project aside from that.
For another meeting.
Yes. And so, two
It
quick
doesn't have
things
ADUs.
on that point, that, again, that comes back to the idea that we asked the community council for a separate resolution talking about the general area. That way we can approach it on the behalf of the community and not in some kind of overhanded way. And we should keep it tight to areas that complain of a problem and not general. But Mr. Dunbar said that the purpose of this amendment is to clarify that the MOU won't have any effect on the assembly. It's actually the other way around. The purpose of the amendment is to require the MOU between those parties, but we want to be clear because in the MOU that they've prepared for us, there is a statement that we shall do something. So that's the secondary element of this. The primary move is to get the MOU process working, and so that's it. And I would move that this committee support Amendment 1.
A second? Let me get a second. Second on that.
I'll second it.
All right.
Briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. When we started this process, I sent in the standards by which the ABC board determines if something is arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable, just so you'll be informed. That's number one. Number two, this venue has not had any NOVs or any violations of any law. So they happened to come on before you because it was renewal time. That was the reason, not because of something they had done. So I need to understand that, and I don't think it was any more of a problem than anybody else in the whole district either, for that matter. And so we've addressed it, and we'll see how it goes, and we'll come back to you when you want us to.
All right, thank you. So we had a motion and a second. Where do we stand? Amy?
My question for you is, with amendment number 2, I see there's nobody that sponsored it, but is the intent that one or the other of these should be incorporated, or is the intent that both of them should be incorporated if we want to restrict size of containers?
I'm not sure what you're referring to when you say one or the other of those. Both amendments.
We haven't discussed.
Well, they're
those two.
written separately. They need to be moved separately.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you guys didn't draft them to be incorporated concurrently. I just wanted to understand that before I voted on the First Amendment.
They're separate.
Nobody asked me to actually do the second one, but we have an MOU that's putting a different, whether agreeing to different container sales restrictions than are in the current resolution. And I think that the intent is that I'm going to be consistent, so I drafted this for something member to move to make the resolution
So then
restrictions consistent with the MOU.
I can't vote on this First Amendment, so I understand.
Yeah, no, I get that.
So let me ask you this then, would it be beneficial for us then, if this Second Amendment reflects what's in the MOU, would it be beneficial to us to adopt the second one as well, just to make it clear in the conditions?
I think the second one would be a complete acknowledgement of the restrictions that the MOU contains. But better for the assembly, we have more restrictive sales restrictions right now with resolutions, and I agree to. I think it might be. I mean, if you look up the arbitrary, capricious, and reasonable standard, it might be looked at as unreasonable to require something beyond what the community and the licensee have agreed to.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you.
Just a point of order, that the intent was to have a discussion on Amendment number 2 briefly next.
Well, I couldn't vote on amendment
No,
number 1 until I understood
Right.
what the whole point was.
Right, and so in the point of the second one is separate from the first one. It doesn't conflict with it in any way.
Well, I just wanted to see if they were supposed to, or...
I get it.
That's valid. Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the bottom line on Amendment 1 is that we are going to be looking at liquor licenses for renewals on a case-by-case, each individual license one at a time, so this is not binding citywide in any way. Is that what the situation
As I
is? Is that correct?
understand it, yes.
Okay, make sure that was out there.
No.
You disagree with that?
Yeah, so it doesn't get to that question at all. The only thing that is in this MOU that came from the community council that attempts to bind the assembly is item number 5. It's on the 1, 2, 3, page 4 at the top, just before the signature. The only item that attempts to bind the assembly, it says the assembly shall schedule a hearing. So that line only addresses really that shall statement, right? This doesn't have anything to do with that broader question. This is a very narrow.
Well, should we change the word shall to may?
That's not our document.
That's not our document,
Oh, all
right?
right.
And so we're saying
amend
instead
that, okay.
that this MOU doesn't bind us to act. That's all that line reflects.
Yeah.
Community councils are nice, but not a function of city government.
Exactly.
They're not a nonprofit organization. They're groups of area aggregates come together and form a community council, but they do not have any binding authority, nor do they get legal counsel from the city, which we've told them numerous times. I appreciate their comments, but it has absolutely nothing that binds us from doing it,
Exactly.
or requires us to do it.
Unless we willingly do.
We got to roll here.
Well, that's another thing.
Mr. Train is correct. So in looking at this issue in drafting these amendments, I reviewed Chapter 240 of our code about community councils and what their purpose and function is. And Mr. Train is correct. They make recommendations. They bring issues to the assembly. They don't direct the assembly to do them.
Okay, I think we have this settled. So we had a motion to recommend approval of Amendment 1 and a second. Can we vote amongst the members here?
Is there any objection?
Any objection? Okay. Good. Now, Amendment number 2. Dean, would you want to speak on that?
Who brought them two forward?
Well, I think I sort of explained a bit
Right.
already, but just to elaborate slightly, this is going to be part of the resolution, and it's simply asking the ABC board under state statute 411 to ABC recommend conditions be added to the license when it's being renewed. Which is adding these specific continuing restrictions to be added. And like I said, they're taken from the MOU and Mark Ryan was currently in the resolution, which is very restrictive. So to be consistent, I think we're recommending these items be added to the license. We don't want to go beyond what the community's agreed to.
Okay.
Yep. So the function that happened here is that the preliminary resolution had some very restrictive elements in it. The community council and the petitioner negotiated in good faith a different set of conditions. And so what this amendment does is establish those conditions that they negotiated in good faith as the conditions of the license, with the intent that in a period of time, the community would come back and say, did it work or not? And so they've asked to step back, the community council has to step back the pressure a little bit on the petitioner, and that's what this does. So that's
And you'd like to make a motion?
And I move to support amendment number 2, and add my name to it as sponsor.
A second on that?
I'll second it.
With Amy, any opposition? All right.
And the final motion is to recommend the approval of the resolution to the assembly.
I'll second that.
Any opposition? All right.
Now we know what we're going to do. Thank you all.
Before we break here, would someone like to sponsor amendment number 1? So we had a sponsor amendment.
Is there one?
Croft is on.
Croft is on.
Croft is on number 1.
Okay, great.
I put myself on number 2.
Okay, moving along. You got that, Dan? You look puzzled.
Well, amendment number 1 was the first one that Mr. Trainee filed the night, or just shortly before the hearing, and that I assume is going away when we adopt number 2, correct?
No.
No, the MOU's done.
Okay. All right, then I'm just a little confused on what was amendment number 1. I thought it was to the same section.
That's on page 3.
I could be wrong. I just don't have that.
Here, I'll take it. You
I'll
can start
look
on
before- And when is this going to be heard?
Tuesday.
Tuesday
Tuesday
night.
night, okay.
I think you got what you want here, largely.
It's billable hours.
But he'll
It
tell you.
incorporates the
Billable
MOU.
hours.
Okay.
That's terrible.
Okay, so moving right along to a smaller issue. Accessory dwelling units. And I will give $1 to the first person who comes up with a much more colorful, attractive name for these things. Something. Mother-in-law doesn't quite work, I think.
It's an old term.
So we had a work session on this. We went through it. We have an S version that responds to that. And now we have, I think, 5 amendments. And what I'd like to do is go through the amendments. And probably not in the order here, because I dropped a couple in last night.
Mr. Chairman, before you begin, can we spend 2 to 5 minutes just giving everyone in the room a quick overview? Of the
Yeah, let's do that.
regular version and the
Sure.
extra?
That's what I
Okay.
said.
I just want to give a quick outline. So we'll do that. And when we get to the amendments, I'd like to do Dick's and then my 2, because they tie in fairly closely, and then go to the Croft and Dunbar amendments. So who would that be? Chris, then? You want to go through it?
Yeah, just real briefly, the differences between the original draft and the S version are a result of the first work session held on AO 2018-23. Largely clarification, stylistic changes, typo fixes, and just tightening the language. And I'll go through this very quickly. We had a lot of questions about some of the phraseology used in the first few lines of the proposed code changes as it relates to ADU permit, and that was a requested change at that work session. However, because the way that there is no existing ADU permit, that the ADU permitting process is distinct, but there is not a piece of paper you walk into the office and say that I'm filling out an ADU beyond the required affidavit. We felt that was fine to stay as was. On 1B, IID, page 3, line 22, this was a request to remove the reference to the Title 21 User's Guide, which we supported and deleted. Page 3, line 46, this is 1B, IIIA2. This was a question about the use of the word dwelling versus residence. And we recommended changing it back to dwelling to ensure consistency throughout the document. Dean, I think you had an opinion on this, or was it just about the way that we formatted the change?
No, it was just the way
Okay.
formatting.
So that change was made to be consistent throughout the document. Page 3, line 47. Page 4, line 3. There was a change made to the way we phrased the term negative impact to on-street parking at the request of Chairman Weddleton. And I don't have my S version copy in front of me, so you can see what the result was, but that was changed. Page 4, lines 8 through 13, there was concern that this was a typo and it was in the wrong section. We disagree. It is deliberately placed there to help lay out the various purposes for having rules around accessory dwelling units, so we opted to keep that one where it was. Let's see. Page 4, line 36.
I'm saying that when you keep lines 14, 17, on page 4, it says
Is there a snowbird?
Lines 8 through 13, it was 1B IIIA4.
I was on page.
Oh, I'm sorry, am I looking at the wrong one? That's correct, Dean. That change was made. Sorry, I'm probably going off the page numbers of the original draft.
It shows that you need to read it, but you're saying you guys wanted to keep it.
No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong section. So that is, I haven't gotten to that one yet, but that is later in my suggested changes because I'm on a different page order than you, but you're correct. So on page 4 of 10 on your S version, the item 4, the deletion was recommended, and we submitted that deletion too.
So, Chris, are we going to work off of this? So we're all looking at this right now, the S version.
Gotcha. So we'll keep moving ahead. Page 5 of 10. This one was a question about the use of the term child care facility versus child care center, and that was a change that we had made in order to fit the proper definition of both terms. Both terms have meanings, and the center one was the incorrect term to use.
Can I ask a question on that? So there is a lot of in-home childcare, that means basically family homes. Does that qualify as a childcare facility?
Sorry, Dean, this was a Dean's edit.
Yes, I recommend it's changed because there's a definition of childcare facility that includes both the childcare center, which is the larger centers that have more than 9 children, and childcare homes where you can care for 5 to 8. So this would include those.
I guess I have a philosophical question. Why do we want to restrict ADUs to child care homes? People who run child. Is that different than, because there's in-home child care where it's a even smaller number of children, right? So a child care home is
there's 3 definitions here. Child care home, which is smaller facilities, less than 8 or less.
Okay.
And then there's the child care center, which is, I believe, 8 or more. And then there's the broader child care facility, which encompasses both of those.
So I understand what you're saying, Mr. Dunbar, why prohibiting ADU on a lot where there's child care home cares for each children. That's the policy question. But if you disagree, then you wouldn't want to make that change. You want to leave it at center, which is for 9 or more children, or 8 or more children. And if you think that an ADU should be allowed on lots with the child care home, then you would want to oppose this change and leave it at center.
So, just kind of piggybacking on what Forrest said, I mean, if the intent of the assembly is to not limit an ADU in a child care home or a child care facility, certainly you've expressed that you don't want to limit it in the child care center, then the question should be asked, is this section even necessary?
And we did
will
ask
admit
that.
It's a remnant
Right.
from current code, and I don't think any of us really know where it came from originally.
We don't.
Because that was at our work session, brought that up, and so why is this in here? And but you didn't find any
No,
reason.
we don't know why it's
Okay.
there, and I can't think of a reasonable reason why it should be there.
Could you have a child care center in residential districts?
You can.
You can.
By administrative site plan review or by conditional use. However, you wouldn't have an ADU with a child care center.
Legally or just practically?
You have to first have a home to have the ADU, so I don't think that legally should be allowed to do that.
Had questions going to think Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what if someone decided they wanted to build an ADU so they could have a child care home and use the 700 or 900 square feet or whatever it was for that specific purpose? Is that the reason that was put in there originally?
I don't believe so, Mr. Peterson. Well, I can't say.
Can I ask a follow-up? So what if, to kind of copy what Mr. Peterson said, but in reverse, someone wants to provide childcare out of their home, they build an ADU to live in, and then run a childcare, business out of their home. Are we opposed to that? I mean, we want more childcare in the city.
Right.
Some neighbors
Childcare is
would be.
wildly expensive in the city, and we're looking for creative
Neighbors
ways to
would
expand it.
Yeah, some neighbors would be opposed.
Yeah,
Talking
so
about traffic.
the practical question in that case is whether or not the child care center is the principal use or accessory to the ADU in essence. And also semi-practically, if you do that, you kind of remove the residential function of the primary structure. So in essence, you're creating a new commercial structure. I don't know the history to this one to give you the fuller story, but I think practically speaking, it presents a lot of challenges.
Well, maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought there was another level of childcare. So you've got childcare homes, childcare centers, but I thought there was another level of childcare where you could provide just in your primary residence. You could provide limited childcare for
childcare home.
So then you're still living in that house. I mean, but you are providing, maybe it's just 2 or 3 children, but you are providing them with childcare, and you're making money on the side, and you're providing someone with quality childcare.
So Forrest, I believe that a child care home is accessory to the principal use of the structure as a residence. In the child care center, and I'd have to check the code, I think child care center is a principal use.
Right, that's why I actually, what I'm getting at is I prefer the original language, because child care center is a larger commercial operation. The child care home, I think, gets down, we get to a point where we are restricting it in a way we don't actually intend.
I totally agree.
That sounds like a potential amendment for Tuesday.
I've already written down amend,
Yeah.
so I mean, of course, I'll let you amend if you want to, or I'll do it.
Please.
I wrote down the same thing. I don't see the necessary need to restrict people that are providers in their own home. I can see somebody maybe having, a mother-in-law or somebody living in an accessory unit in their backyard. I mean, childcare I used while my kids were little. It was out of a primary home, and my 2 kids were the only 2 kids that were watched. And so I could see that, and I would not want to limit that.
Right.
Dean, could you prepare that amendment?
Right. I can hand the code book to Dave so he can speak to it, but so the table of allowed uses for principal uses, a child care center, 9 or more children. Okay, let me start with the child care home. Child care home, up to 8, like Dave said, is a permitted principal use. You're not required to, if you have a house, you're running a child care home, you're not required to live there. It can be permitted principal use in all of these districts. It's a permitted principal use, it's not an accessory, that's what I'm getting to, Dave. And then a child care center, 9 or more, is allowed as a permitted principal use, either with a conditional use permit or a site plan review. None of the child care is accessory. So you're just allowed to have it. That's because you can have 2 principal uses on the property. The home could be your home, which is a permitted principal use, and it could be a child care home. There's nothing about child care in the table of accessory uses, is what we're getting to. Except for ADUs are accessory to principal use. So I don't know if that helps clarify things or muddy the waters. But it's, so yeah, I mean, just because we think of child care homes and child care centers as being accessory, or, well, yeah, I mean, in someone's home, my wife takes care of other kids. So she's running a child care home. She's not. It's a permitted principal use. Only on Tuesdays. But yeah, so it's permitted principal use. If we didn't live there, the house could sit empty except for when there's childcare, and the kids are being delivered in that.
That's a great point. I stand corrected on that.
So, I'm
that
sorry.
help for us?
I know it doesn't. I'm confused now. I'm more confused now. So are you speaking in favor of leaving it as a facility, or you think we should change it back to center?
Well, I'll let Chris and Dave speak to that. I actually don't have that in front of me. I'm just saying that if the home, the home in the neighborhood, residential neighborhood, behind us, whatever, off the 64th, you can use that house as your house. You can use that house as a house and a child care home. You can use it just as a child care home and not live there. And child care center is a conditional use. We don't often see that in someone's individual home.
Right.
The accessory dwelling units are always accessory to somebody living there.
So I think the short answer for us is yank it out.
Yeah.
Okay, Amy?
So I just want to make sure, just to make it more confusing, just make sure I understand. I think I get what Francis is saying, but in the case of an ADU, if that child care home is only being used as a child care home and nobody is living there, then the ADU would not be permitted because you have to actually live in the home in order.
Right.
Got it?
That's good.
Okay.
Okay. Just making sure I understood it.
Okay. Chris?
And I agree with taking it out. I think because if you put in facility, then you actually do reach down into a permitted use and kind of scramble the list of uses, and that would create a restriction in a weird corner of the code. And so, I agree.
I have one more question for the
Sure.
group. So, understanding the fact that you can only get an ADU if somebody is living in the primary home that's there. Obviously, a facility wouldn't count as a primary home, a child care facility. Are there any where people live in the facility?
They can live in either structure. They just have to live in one of them.
Okay, because I'm trying to understand if we should just take out this entire section. I mean, to me, I don't understand why it's there. So,
So through the chair, we would support removal of 4A as it relates to childcare. The remaining section B, the requirement that a landowner reside in either
That's
the
fine.
regular.
yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that.
Just kill the whole section.
It's just 4A. I'm thinking just delete the whole section.
Yeah, so if you want to delete all of A and then renumber B to D, letter A, that would be great.
Is anybody opposed to that?
Do you want to make a motion? We'll do it as a
Sure.
committee thing.
I would like to amend the S version to remove section 4A from page 5 of 10.
A second on that?
I can't.
I'll second it.
You got a name tag.
I don't actually sit on this.
Isn't the chair a member of every committee?
No.
No.
No? What? Okay, that's a second somewhere?
I seconded
Okay,
it, John.
any opposition? Oh, thank you.
You've been ignoring me, but I did second
Oh,
it.
sorry.
So 10 years and they revisit this.
Okay, so we've got a motion to pull 4A regarding childcare, and there was no opposition to recommending that on Tuesday. Okay, good, thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, will that take the form of an amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll have Dean will write that up. All right, thanks. Moving on, Mr. Schutte.
Yeah, we're almost there. So Kate, the next change is all the way on your page 9 of 10, just to correct the permit application date for units that are not in compliance. Originally, when this was written, we were ambitious and thought we could get it wrapped up in 2014. And that was incorrect. So we've changed that to a 6 month of the effective date of this ordinance. And then lastly, I think I skipped one, but there was one page where all of the legislative references at the bottom, we didn't have those correct, and Dean did his usual sleuth work and found all the correct ordinance and code references to relist, and so that was the other change, other than some typos on pages 4, 30, and 39. So largely, it's minor changes between the original draft and the S version, largely stylistic. And that brings us to today, and we're ready for amendment.
All right, thanks.
That was more than 5 minutes.
No, sorry.
It's okay. It was our fault, I think.
Oh, that was good. So, well, let's just start with training amendment number 1. And Dick, do you want to?
Mine's simple, it just requires you to have a 10,000 square foot lot, consistent with the way it is now. And my other concern with the administration is, if we adopt this ADU, does that get rid of R1 zoning in Anchorage completely?
Through the chair, no, it does not.
So you can still have R1 zoning, but what if your neighbor decides they want to put an ADU on there? Doesn't that in effect get rid of your R1 zoning?
Through the chair, no, it does not. In fact, that's the current law of the land, provided it's an attached ADU. So there are a number of R1 and R1A zone properties across the bowl currently that do have an accessory dwelling unit on them.
But years ago when we did this, we settled on 10,000 square foot. So what is going to be the new requirement? Anything at all?
So through the chair, so the underlying requirements of the existing zoning districts have not been changed in any way. So there still are minimum lot size requirements, setback requirements, height restrictions, et cetera. The primary difference between the current law of the land and what we propose is that we'd like to remove the restriction on R1 and R1A for having a 10,000 square foot lot, because those lots are very rare across the bowl. And then the second was the alley abutment issue. Alley abutments are ideal for detached, particularly as people picture them being, I heard a laneway house thrown out earlier, you picture them as being laneway houses, and that continues to be true, that's very appealing. Not every lot in town that abuts an alley, though, is 10,000 square feet. We'd like to make this as less restrictive as possible to give homeowners the opportunity to explore additional units in their on their property.
Well, what do we tell people that bought R1 because they did not want to live with multiple people around them? They expected to be in R1. And now we're telling them, it doesn't matter, with this, your neighbor can put an ADU on their property.
So through, oh, sorry, go ahead. Dave. I was going to say, through the chair, we hear that a lot, that this is a de facto rezoning.
Yeah.
The zoning of the parent lot does not change, nor do any of the restrictions that go with that zoning type. The only difference between what's happening today and what we're proposing to happen is that currently attached ADUs, you really have no sense of whether or not there is a quote-unquote duplex next door. And attached ADUs are closer in form to a duplex. It is 2 units of living within one structure. We think having the flexibility to do a detached accessory dwelling unit, one that fits with the scale of the neighborhood and works within the underlying zoning, is a way to add additional units. It does add an additional dwelling to the property, but it is accessory to the primary one, and we think it can fit very well in any neighborhood in this city, much like it has across the country.
Okay. Came out of Portland?
ADUs have come out of every jurisdiction.
I know, but I saw articles that you guys went to Portland to get this model and bring it up here.
Through the chair, know that the language, the code language is a product of multiple jurisdictions. The reference to Portland in particular was they have an annual tour of ADUs, much like we have a parade of homes. And a couple of members of the Live, Work, Play housing group visited to see what these look like. So we had a sense of what we could expect.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, and just a comment. I've got, my 2 amendments regard the R1 and R1A as well, and just tone down, increase the requirements on ADUs in R1 and R1A. So it's like, if this were approved, mine would be irrelevant. So as we move forward, we'd want to look at my 2 before we comment on this one.
Oh, okay, you want to do them all together?
Roughly.
The
So any
challenge-
comments on Amendment 1?
Yeah, the challenge I have with this is that it would essentially restrict all of the R1, R1A in the district I live in from having an ADU.
I know.
And
We knew that years ago when we did it.
Yeah, and I have neighbors that are asking for that. And so I have a hard time supporting it because it's a blanket restriction that doesn't narrowly target a set of properties, but in fact, in my district, takes every one of them off the table.
I've got the exact opposite. I've got lots of people that do not want this change. They want to keep it at 10,000 square foot limit.
I understand, so I can't support it.
Okay, so an issue we expect. Any comments from committee? Staff comments on it?
I would just say that ADUs are permitted right now in the R1, R1A districts. They just have to be attached. This ordinance proposes to allow them to be detached. So to Mr. Train's point, you know, if they're intended to be accessory to the permitted principal use of the structure of single family. You know, the only difference here is attached versus detached. The ordinance proposes to allow them to be detached.
Or you have to tap it?
Question, Mr.
Okay, Pete?
But are they allowed to be built ADUs and they're required to have 10,000 square feet now?
No.
No.
they're
So
not.
that's an additional change.
So the detached ADUs in all other districts, excluding the R1, R1A, are required to be 10,000 square feet. Detached are not allowed in the R1, R1A. This ordinance proposes to allow detached in all residential zoning districts. Mr. Cheney's amendment would require detached ADUs in the R1, R1A districts to either abut an alley or be 10,000 square foot lot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Amy?
So just to make sure I'm tracking, so you just said Mr. Trainees would require either 10,000 square foot or to abut an alley. Am I understanding that correctly?
It keeps the current code intact.
Right.
It's currently allowed.
But even I'm trying to struggle because I don't really see the difference. Initially, I was thinking limit these to 10,000 square foot too, but now I'm thinking I don't see the difference because we're not changing the percentage necessarily of how much a structure can cover the lot, right?
Correct.
So that amount is staying the same. So it's just how we're configuring what's on the lot.
That's exactly.
So I'm not really. If we have the same amount of lot coverage, Dick, what is it just the density potentially?
It's the density.
Because
Take a look at what we've done to Mountain View with the density we put up there. And I don't want to see that density increase all over Anchorage.
But
As you
current-
put more people on the land,
Right.
you can handle less people,
But in those areas, current code would allow an attached ADU, right?
but not a detached.
So again, it's still the same thing, it's just how we're reconfiguring it.
It's how it will look and how close the homes will be to each other.
I understand. Okay.
All right, thanks. So moving on then to Weddleton Amendment number 1, and my 1 and 2 are largely replicate what was in the Planning and Zoning Commission packet. And I think in that case, did Tom Davis write that staff report, or how's that work?
I wrote the staff report.
You did, okay.
Tom wrote comments.
Okay, so there were a couple suggestions to the planning department that if you wanted to tone it down in R1 and R1A, perhaps these amendments would work. And I actually made some minor modifications, but that's where I drew from. And I think it's acknowledging what Dick has said, is there is a difference. R1A people go in expecting single-family homes, and even if now we do allow ADUs, the expectation is still, I have a neighbor on either side, they're single-family, and I don't have to meet the second family that lives there. So I think we should respect that. And this adds some restrictions to what you can build in R1 and R1A, so that it would be a little more, less imposition on those zones, but would still allow it. So amendment number 1 essentially puts the, what this new proposal does is increases the size from 700 to 900, right, as a maximum. And also 35% of total gross floor area. Now we allow, new one would be 75 in Class A, right? Okay, so this bumps it back to where it is now. So it would allow, this amendment would allow detached ADUs in R1 and R1A, but it would shrink them a bit, shrink them to the size that we have now. Comment?
Yeah, I don't intend to support this amendment. And the reason is because I think, well, there are a couple of reasons. I mean, the big philosophical one is I'm pretty in favor of people being able to do on their land what they want to do, given some compelling reason. But the other one is, I think you're right, Mr. Welton, in your district, in some of the newer neighborhoods in your district, I think people do make those kind of decisions. And maybe Mr. Constance could speak to this too, his experience as a realtor, but in East Anchorage and West Anchorage and some of the more built out areas where you have zoning scattered, I think, of all different kinds abutting each other. I don't actually think people buy thinking, I'm going to buy an R1A so I don't have neighbors. I think they go and they look for a nice house in a neighborhood they think is nice, and they probably don't have a good sense. They might know what the zoning is, but it's not a primary factor. And then later down the line, those houses have changed homes many times in some cases. And then later down the line, I think we'll get a case where someone wants to build an ADU and they realize, oh, my neighbor has this zoning, I have this zoning. Our houses look very similar because we're in this old neighborhood, but I'm restricted because it happens to be R1 or R1A. So I think that your experience is sort of colored by your district, which has a little bit of different nature than the housing market in some other districts. And my concern is that this amendment impacts those other districts as well.
And I would add to that, sir.
Yeah, Chris.
Just that comes back to this idea that in these very large lot neighborhoods, especially new subdivisions and development, they have the right to restrict the development that they see fit through organizing themselves. And land rights just seem to be something that are valuable for people to be able to utilize. And an HOA has a lot of power in this town. In fact, South Anchorage is covered with them. These large lot areas, new big beautiful homes, you can't do an ADU, and in fact you can't do a child care facility if it drives cars to your front door.
Sometimes you can't build a detached garage.
Or even a septic system.
Put up a fence.
So
Well, actually, I just clarify, this does not deal with the large lots. I mean, large lots, R5, R6, R7, that it would be hillside. And as we saw in our work session, most of the accessory dwelling units are in that area. I'm not dealing with that. That works fine. It seems to be working. I have not heard complaints in my years dealing with hillside
I think
issues.
large lots mean different things to different people, right? So when I live in my neighborhood, the average lot size is 7,000 square foot, and there are some lots that are roughly 10,000 to 12,000, but everything else is small. So a large lot's 10,000 square feet, or maybe 15, and so I think it's a.
My house is on 4,000 square feet.
Right.
Okay.
HOAs are nice, but not enforced by the city. HOAs have to be enforced by the homeowners association. So they don't have the full force of law that if it's zoned by the city and the city restricts that we've got. HOAs, you've got to take each individual, if they violate it, to court to enforce it. And if they don't do it, then it becomes irrelevant. So you can't just ignore some and then decide, oh, we're now going to enforce this HOA, because that won't stand up in court. I've known numerous times it hasn't. But how do I tell my people that bought R1 in Rogers Park, Airport Heights, Tudor Community Council area, that it's nice you bought R1 for a specific reason, but now the city's said that reason doesn't exist anymore?
I tell them it's still R1.
But you can put a house right next to it if they've got less than 10,000 square feet. That 10,000 square foot was the minimum we had to ensure the homes could stay the way they are.
That's separate. That's your amendment we've moved on from.
I know, I'm just telling you. I've got some in my area that like this ADU, but I've got the majority that does not want it. So, just to let you know.
So that's good discussion on this.
Well, can we hear from staff on this before?
Sure.
we move forward?
Okay.
Is there any-
Oh, I'm sorry, and Dean had his. Let's start with Dean, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask almost the same thing, but I wanted to hear from staff about whether
Okay.
Mr. Trainey's amendment and Mr. Wellington's, they could coexist, isn't that correct? Because Mr. Wellington's
Guess they
is
could.
limiting size of ADUs. Mr. Trainey's
they
is
could.
long down, all one of
Could coexist.
And how about Mr. Dunstance?
Chair Weddleton summed it up eloquently. This doesn't restrict detached ADUs. All this does is limit the size. It basically reverts back to what existing code is in our Class A districts, 700 square feet or 35%, whichever is less. So theoretically, you could have a detached ADU in the R1A district if you have a 10,000 square foot lot or you abut an alley. However, it could only be restricted to 700 square feet or 35% of the principal dwelling, whichever is less.
But no, I would say mine standing alone from Dick's does not have that 10,000 square foot requirement. This would be, right?
Correct, but the question was,
If they coexisted, right, okay, sure.
We could.
Okay. So any comments generally then on this amendment?
I think
I think the ordinance that we presented, we feel like is a good ordinance. However, we're willing to accept the 700 or 35%.
And through the chair, I'll add that the push to increase the size of the square footage came at the behest of the designers and builders that serve on the Live Work Play housing group that have struggled with how to design and build 700 square foot accessory dwelling units. A couple of them are chuckling behind me right now. So certainly, if you want to hear more input on that, I'd recommend you ask a few of them.
And I believe as an action item in the 2040 plan, it talked about increasing the size for ADUs. So the reason behind this ordinance is because it's an action item in the 2040 plan.
Right.
Part of that speaks to increasing the size.
Right, understood.
well, that was going to be my question. I mean, my biggest problem with this amendment is I've been surfing different design plans for tiny homes and stuff, and to me, 700 feet and 900 feet, though 200 feet may not seem like a big deal, I think in a small dwelling like this, it could be a huge deal. And so I'm very apprehensive to diminish it from the proposal, simply because I really think that 200 feet in such a small area could be a huge benefit if somebody's going to build.
I'd like to, I'll get to Tyler in a moment, but the 700 feet, one thing in emails that we got, I was asking, what is the main constraint? And primarily that was that it's not open in R1 and R1A, not the size so much. So I'm sure that's often an issue. People want huge houses. But there's a good discussion in the packet that went to the Planning Commission that talks about kind of model cities with ADUs, and the sizes vary quite a bit, but 700 was not unusual, and our 700 does not include garages. So you got a 2-car garage under this thing, you've got a pretty big structure. Other cities included the garage in their measurements. So if you just compare Seattle and Santa Monica, or whatever the California city was, but the other ones, and look at just the square footage, you might say, well, theirs is bigger. Theirs includes if there's a garage or not. And that's a very significant, because what's a garage is 24 feet by 12 or something like that. Well, you got 300 something square feet right there. So this could be a fairly large structure. we need to factor that in. So this was presented to the Planning Commission, and they discussed it somewhat. Tyler can embellish.
Well, from where Planning Commission had, I think we heard testimony from people that had tried to, that had issues with the size, squeezing it into 700 square feet. So actually removing space from this area above a garage to comply with it, or almost creating, almost walled off space within the structure, which seemed, a little silly. I think the other thing that, from my perspective, I can show you some that we've built that aren't ADUs. They're in multifamily district, but they were designed to sort of model an ADU. A lot of them that you see in other places have external staircases, right? And so what we try to do is provide a landing and an entry that is covered on the downstairs just to meet our climate, and so that you wouldn't have this open. Clearly that would reduce, but that would be the first thing you would do, right, is you would take on any additional space outside the garage, and you just leave it exterior, and it just, we made a call that it wasn't the right, the right thing to do for a winter city. But John, I just wanted to comment on your amendment goes back to the 35%. That would be in addition to 700, which, and I saw a lot of model ordinances that were 800 as well, and their numbers all over the map. But I think you also go back to 35% of the total gross area of the principal structure too, which is by far a bigger limiter than the going from 900 to 700 square feet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so more of that. You want me to go to the Amendment 2? Weddleton Amendment 2. Anybody else want to add anything? Let's go through these. I'll go through this one, and then maybe we can go over it very quickly because we will run out of time for people who visited just on this R1, R1A side of it. Does that work? Okay, so number 2 is somewhat similar. Is building height. And there is an example in the Planning and Zoning Commission packet of how if you have a 25-foot building height, and 25 feet is measured to halfway on a sloped roof, so it's actually your building could be 3, 4, 5 feet taller, that you could have a 3-story structure that would be quite narrow and odd looking. So this sets the maximum height for a detached ADU 22 feet in the R1 and R1A districts, and 25 in the other districts. So the 25 is where we are now, and this just changed for the R1 and R1A, slightly lower height.
Mr. Middleton, may I just quickly speak to this? If this amendment was to go forward, I would recommend also modifying dimensional standards in Chapter 6 with regard to garage, detached accessory garages and carports to 22 feet. So the ordinance, as proposed, amends that section to be consistent with the ADU section that allows for a detached ADU to be 25 feet in height. If we're going to amend this to reduce it by 3 feet to 22 feet, we would also need to do the dimensional standards to 22 feet.
And that was in the planning packet, I think. I couldn't quite follow the discussion on that. So, okay. So there's another, if this goes 22 feet for the ADU, we have to have that, should have it matched.
You should
for the garages and so on.
Chapter 6 to 22. And that's just to be consistent.
Okay. Okay, Amy?
I have a question for some of the builders out there. I'm thinking about garage door heights and impacts. You start lowering the height for garages. What impact would that have?
Maybe it's a question for Brian.
It affects sales. I mean, Alaska or Anchorage has lots of people with big SUVs, and an 8-foot garage door and a 7-foot garage door excludes a vast portion of them.
I always go for bigger, so I prefer 12-foot personally, but.
Well, would a 22-foot height restrict the garage door so much?
Potentially, depending on the topography of the lawn.
Are you concerned about a 3-story within a 25-foot height? Is that the concern, or is it the height itself?
The shadowing effect.
Well, the height's part of it because you have shadowing, which has been, in the comments we've gotten from public, has been that's been a key point. But then also the look if you got 3 stories. So it could have gone not 3 stories, but it sounded like it was simpler in reading through the packet that the 22 feet was made more sense.
And they just, you know, if I may, when you're building smaller spaces, and we're not at the point of building micro units like San Francisco and other places, right? So it's 700-800 square foot apartments, they're pretty small from what most of our perspectives are. So what you do is you build higher ceilings, right? So I mean, I just have a hard time imagining 3 stories in 25, personally, from what, you know, I'm sure somebody could do it, but it'd be really kind of silly for them to do that.
There were pictures in your packet.
There's that one in South Edition that we'd all drive by on 15. That's the one I can, you know, there's always the one.
Which one? It's in their packet.
I'm sorry, South
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we got that. Any other comments from around the
Gentleman had a
table?
comment
Let me
here.
get this real quick, and then we'll do it. We'll get you next.
So I guess I'm just, I want to be clear what we're talking about here. Detached ADU on an ADU on a detached garage, is that a detached or an attached?
Detached.
So would this make it impossible to do certain kinds of ADUs on top of garages that we talked about?
Through the chair, potentially.
Well, depending on topography, we heard.
Well, that's unfortunate. I like those ADUs.
So do I.
No, but this is not generally restrictive. I mean, it's not uncommon either in ADU land. If you read the Planning and Zoning Commission packet that we got, I mean, this is not shutting it down at all. This is actually probably fairly typical of what would be built. It just doesn't let those ones that are just a little bit higher.
So, Mr. Welton, if the concern is bulk scale, shadowing, I think the proposed ordinance deals with that. We addressed this issue at the Planning and Zoning Commission, where this idea of limiting height was brought up. We also, and the Planning and Zoning Commission chose to go with an additional setback for those detached ADUs above 15 feet. So, if that's the concern, I feel like it's addressed in the additional setback, the 5-foot setback that was imposed as part of this ordinance.
Right. Yeah, and to be clear, the Planning Commission did not go this way, and this was in their packet as, hey, you might want to consider this. So understand this. And this reflects to me the comments we've been getting from the public is this is something they're looking for. So I wanted to put it in play. Any other comments here? Dean? Okay. Oh, let me get Dean real quick, and then, sorry. Dean?
Okay. I just wanted clarification. Mr. Whitfield said if this one passes, that we should also amend Chapter 2106. I don't think we can add that in this ordinance because it's subject to the title. But would that be something then that would be proposed by separate ordinance? Remember dimensional standards?
No, it's in there. It's in the title. It's in the title.
Separate ordinance from the planning.
It's in the title.
It's in the title.
It's in the title.
Oh, you were talking about the table?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Porter?
In the underlying ordinance, or the existing ordinance, you state, or it states that you want architectural character, and you want style, and you want the ADU to be synonymous, or harmonious rather, and in the same design style. If you cut 2 feet, 3 feet out of that with the roof lines we have, and, you know, if the existing house has a 12 pitch roof, you can't match that style, or you're going to be much more restricted. So by restricting this, you create much more of a design issue. You create a more stringent design set of conditions, and it makes it much harder to solve the problem that way. I don't know that you're going to see a great deal of difference between the impact of 3 feet doesn't seem important to me, but it does in the design side. But you know, I understand where you're coming from. But all the other restrictions that Dave talked about still are in existence, and you have to deal with those. And so I don't see where the 22 feet. The 22 feet just makes it much more restrictive. In matching styles of the structure.
So if it were changed to not over 2 stories, is that clear enough direction, or is that?
We have to be careful when we mix stories and
Yes.
right, because we get ourselves in a pickle.
We're dealing with that right now.
Right.
We're going to split.
2.5.
I want the mix is not stories.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just one last comment, because Mr. Whitfield was very helpful in offering other changes. I don't think he started out his helpful comment by saying we would recommend against this amendment.
Okay. So real busy. We have a couple more amendments to go through, but I said I would go through. So comments, Diane, briefly. Just on these three amendments, not broadly on ADUs.
Well, they're all together.
Let's wait. That works. Anybody else? No? Okay. So I guess I would say, how do you want to handle it? We made, sometimes in the committee we'll make recommendations for any of these. You want to go through all and maybe or maybe not make recommendations?
Well, I know we won't be unanimous.
No, we're
I understand
definitely.
that.
We're not.
Yeah.
So I think with this, I think it's probably better.
If we do it on the floor of the assembly.
I mean, I'm more than happy to kill your amendments here. I mean, if you want to go there, but I would prefer to allow you to give your pitch
Yeah, okay.
unimpeded at the to the whole assembly.
So let's move on to Croft Amendment number 2.
Let you try.
No, that's fine. I know I'm out on a plank doing this stuff,
I
but
appreciate your I appreciate
respects the comments we've gotten from the public, and I think they carry a lot of legitimacy.
Agreed.
We've heard,
And I
so.
think it makes for a good discussion.
Okay, so let's look at Croft Amendment number 2. He's not here to defend it.
Chairman, if you'd like, I can speak on behalf of Councilman
Please.
Croft. He reached out to us for help with
Okay.
this. Simply put, his amendment is an attempt to let the code changes as we originally proposed run their course for a few years. I think he set a date of 2022 to see how the provision changes that we're recommending actually manifest themselves, and then come back and reevaluate after a given period. And I think that was his only intent in this amendment.
Any comments?
Just who's going to monitor that time
Yeah,
period
here's
to bring
what the
it forward this,
administration's
2022?
So the way that he drafted it, unless I'm misunderstanding it, Dean, the way that he drafted it is the code changes that we're proposing now would be in place during that period of 2022. Unless affirmative action were taken by the body, it would revert back to today's standards.
But what's your perspective?
Sunset.
Oh, I'm sorry, what's my perspective?
The administration.
Well, nobody likes sunset clauses for zoning code because it's hard to plan around that all the time. But if that is the sweetener that allows the changes that we think are going to be most effective and move forward, then so be it.
All right, thanks. Dean?
Yeah, there's a provision in our code in Title I. I made a reference at the end of the purpose statement here. And it says the clerk needs to monitor any ordinances with the sunset clause and put it on an assembly agenda at least 60 days prior to the sunset date. So as the clerk is supposed to monitor the date to bring it back before the assembly, before this expiration.
Okay.
Since we're asking who monitors.
Great. Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think his intent here, that seems to me like he just wants us to take a look at how this is working 4 years from now and see if we need to tweak it a little bit. And we'd probably be getting feedback from builders and people in the building department all the way along over the next couple of years. But he wanted to make sure that we would specifically take a look at it before June 1st, 2022.
All right, thank you. Forrest?
John?
Yeah,
In here.
I agree with you that's the intent, Pete. I think this is a little bit of a heavy-handed way to do that because we can always go back and tweak. We can look how it's going, and this is more like a sort of Damocles hanging over our heads. I'm more what I'm also curious about. This is more of a legal question. I don't know if someone from planning or a team could speak to it, but building takes a long time. What stage of building? How would grandfather rights work on this? So, like, let's say you start a new project. Do you have to have a certain % built or a certain % designed, or could you be almost done and then this sunsets and now you're out of compliance? How does it work exactly?
Sure. I mean, run with.
Yeah, so the way that we've looked at this, because it comes up, it actually came up a lot with the new Title II rewrite. As long as the building permit has been submitted and is in review, then you would effectively be under the previous ordinance. So you'd be grandfathered.
Can I have a follow-up on that as
Yeah.
well? So do we think this would have a chilling effect on ADU construction? And if it was to have a chilling effect, how far back do you think that would go? Would it be a couple months out? Would it be 6 months out?
I think that as we saw in the Title 21 rewrite, you're going to see a number of people coming forward, scrambling for permits just to construct under the ordinance. You know. I think that you will. And Brian, you know this.
There's lots of us that know that, yeah.
So it wouldn't have a chilling effect, it would actually have an accelerator.
Yeah.
I think it would.
Yeah, right.
Let me hold
A
on.
bubble and then it will taper off.
Yeah.
If I can
Dave?
add to this, Dean brought up a point that it's the clerk's responsibility to monitor the sunsetting of certain provisions in code. I'd like to know how that's done, because I see this as particularly problematic from an implementation standpoint. We deal with this every day. I like the intent. I think it's nice to revisit things, but to sunset it, I feel like it's particularly problematic.
So, through
John.
the chair, I'll let Mandy chime in with this, but we're currently going through it right now with a number of our boards and commissions. In fact, I just got invited to a work session in October, because the clerk's office is on top of the need to revisit any sort of sunsetted body. So I have a lot of faith in the clerk's office in monitoring and following these sunset dates and properly notifying the body and us about it.
All right, good, thank you. Chris?
You know, there's a huge difference between boards and commissions and planning and zoning of a building of a project, permitting and going from someone spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on an initiative. And yeah, it definitely raises the question of what happens like 6 months out when you start to plan a project, you know, and where's that, I can imagine some hardship. So I don't know if I support this, but I know I don't support this hard date of June 1st, 2022, 4 years from effective date, or maybe 4 years from first permit, or something along those lines. But if there's a big window between when this is signed into law and becomes effective, then that's already eaten a huge chunk of the time. And then you're already looking at the back end and figuring out where's this going to end and how are we going to get there. And so if this were to pass, I would recommend that we move it to a time specific relative to the effective date, not a date-specific point in time. But the bigger challenge is what Dave pointed out. It's not, the clerk can do whatever she needs to do, but that doesn't change what's happening in the planning department at the permitting desk and when they're making their recommendations to builders on how to proceed, or developers, or anyone who's interested in making a change. And so there's a cluster there that I don't know how one would sort.
So through the chair, as Mr. Whitfield alluded to, we've gone through this exercise before with the switch over from old code to new code. It's not that hard to manage. If this were to pass, I mean, we would live with it. I personally feel that I'd like to get away from sunset clauses in this case, but if this is what Assemblymember Croft thinks is important in order to preserve the code changes as we presented them, then we can live with that. We can manage it. We can follow it for the next 4 years very closely.
All right, thank you. Dick?
It just makes no sense to put a sunset on this, because quite frankly, clerks come and clerks go. There's going to be a big change in the clerk's office in 4 years. There'll be a big change on the assembly in 4 years. If it's important enough to bring it forward, we can do it at that time. I don't think we need to have a time bomb put out there 4 years.
All right, thank you. Anything else on this? Okay. Good discussion. So we have the final one. This is Dunbar Amendment 3, which tells me there's a story somewhere.
I thought it was Amendment 1.
Your amendment. Oh, maybe it's your amendment 1, but it's 3 in our.
Where's 1 and 2?
It does say Dunbar Amendment 3 on it, but it should be Dunbar Amendment 1.
I think it's your number 1, but it was
had
1, 2, and 3.
Yeah,
That's
we had
what
training
it was.
loads.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a little bit different character than the other amendments we've done. So this doesn't, it shouldn't at least, and Dean and I kind of scrambled on writing this, but it shouldn't alter at all what is the S version in terms of parking. That is to say that the current procedure to get parking for an ADU would stay the same. The current as in what's in the S version. This is additional. This is trying to be innovative, trying to have an alternate route where someone could meet parking requirements. And so what it is essentially a no-car covenant that you can see. You can read it here. That no additional parking shall be required for the accessory dwelling unit if the owner or developer of the real property executes a covenant in a form acceptable to the director, prohibiting the ADU from being leased, rented, or otherwise resided in by a person who owns or leases a motor vehicle. And this is sort of an acknowledgement of the kind of people we think might be living in ADUs. So people who are aging in place, who may no longer require a motor vehicle, and young people who increasingly, in other parts of the country, and hasn't really come to Anchorage yet, partly because our society isn't structured in that way, but might want to ride a bicycle or walk to work, live in a denser area, and not have a car. Again, it's very common on the East Coast. We haven't quite reached that level of density, but that is in part what we are reaching for here, is a multimodal community where elderly people who are young, or anyone in the middle who just doesn't want to have a car, isn't required to have a parking space. And so that's it. It hasn't been attempted in other communities yet, to my knowledge, except I think in Sitka they're going forward with this as well. They already passed it. Yeah, they passed it in Sitka. And that's it. Sitka.
Brief comment on this. What if they have a motorcycle or scooter?
You know what? I did not think about that. I guess it says motor vehicle, so I think you would be out of luck with a motorcycle.
What about a motorized bicycle?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, the electric, not motorized. I don't know, Dean. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I'm not sure that fall under the definition, but they have registered motorcycles.
Do you register motorcycles in the same
Yes,
way?
we
Do
do.
you require parking spaces? Then I think you'd be stuck. But I would entertain a motion to make an exception for motorcycles if you like.
So more than two-wheeled vehicles.
That's right.
No, three.
We discriminate against unicycles.
Okay, okay, Brian?
I was just gonna play devil's advocate. What if I live in one of these units and I bike to work, but I buy my mom a car or my child a car, and that car's off-site, never can come here, but I'm the registered owner. Or I own a business and that business owns multiple motor vehicles. How do we differentiate between vehicle actually drive home or not drive home? In this language. So it's a case of intent versus enforcement, and sometimes enforcement can be very punitive and completely toss out the intent of the ordinance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But I again, my intent is to make this more flexible and to try to allow more people to build these and live in these. I think that enforcement would be complaint driven. That seems to be the case in a lot of places. That is to say, it is relatively difficult for and Mr. Sheedy's expressed this to me, it's relatively difficult for the municipality to go out and affirmatively figure out everybody who has a car and doesn't have a car. Where I think this would come into play is if an ADU is built without additional parking, and then someone does bring a car there, their neighbors are going to complain, and then they can go and enforce this. So I think that would be the difference. The chances, if they were to own a car and it was off-site and it was never an issue, then I doubt that the complaint would go forward that it would cause this.
All right, thanks. Let me go Chris, Amy, and then Tyler.
Well, no, it's right on that topic. I don't see here how you would go to the Department of Motor Vehicles. I don't know that that's reasonable or rational. And enforcement is really the trick. And
It's all complaint driven, Chris.
I understand that. Just it's one of those things that sets neighbors up against neighbors.
All right, Amy?
I was just thinking, Forrest, is there a way you could add a little tagline onto a couple of these sentences just to say whether somebody owns it or not, the intent is for the vehicle to be owned and reside on property? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think that would clarify it, because who cares if you own it if the car is in Vegas, and your daughter's going to school down there or something.
Right.
But or even, they just live somewhere else, because I'm thinking of like my husband, for example, and he has multiple cars in his name and he owns them with his mom, she's.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm definitely open to that. And,
if you could wordsmith that, I think it would be an easy fix.
Tyler?
Just a comment on design. A lot of Anchorage designs, and this is one that we did, will have, in order to capture a parking space in front of a garage, has to have 22 feet of a driveway and then the garage. And so, you effectively have an ADU garage setback, 46 feet onto the property from the alley. So when you look at this compared to other communities, where parking is more flexible, you can even parallel park, where there aren't as many spaces required, that ADU ends up a lot closer to the alley, and the owner, it doesn't feel as compacted. And so I just, it's a nuanced way to say, when you look at character of other communities, look at how close those ADUs are often to the alley versus what the notion of what our parking requirements often do. And some of it is like, I'm gonna do this because it might be my market, I might need those parking spaces. But if I need the spaces, then I lose my backyard as a result of it. So that, if it helps that, then I certainly would be worth a try, in my opinion.
So you're saying if you have a garage on an alley and you have to, and you have to provide another parking spot, you'd have your, instead of being right on the alley, it'd have to be 22 feet
That's right. If you
further
want to
back.
capture a parking space in front of your garage, you will need it, about curving around at least 22 feet.
For the meeting to recognize that it's legal.
As long as the parking space.
And was that a picture of from an
That's
alley?
20
Was that from an
The
alley?
edge there is an alley.
Okay.
That's on Cordova Street, and then you're 22 feet. So that's a function, in our case, it's a function of it being a triplex. So that's different. But if it's a function of it being a requirement of the additional parking space in front of your two-car garage, then it has an impact on how that feels on the lot.
Okay.
So,
Sorry, Forrest?
no, that's it. I'm gonna bring this forward on Tuesday. I recognize that it's innovative and hasn't been tested out other ways, but I think we need to start thinking about how we, Anchorage is always gonna be a car-dominated culture. It's just the layout of our city. We're trying
And our
to
climate.
remove certain.
So just a point of
remove
order,
options.
I'm gonna make a motion to extend 10 minutes.
Yeah, I was thinking
We've got a
15.
meeting
I'm
at
willing to
11
start
o'clock,
the work
Chris.
session late, so we get the public,
Okay.
the,
We have a
we're
meeting
going
at 11
downtown for the
o'clock.
work
Yeah, I know.
session.
I
Go
think,
15.
okay, I think we could do it in 10, but we could do
So
15.
give the public a chance to
Yeah.
talk. Yeah.
Okay, 15 minutes. Is there a second?
I don't really think we need a work session, so we can just run over.
Is that right? Okay.
We can.
Okay, Bill, then I guess that works.
Speaking of run over, you're
Suzanne
gonna
has
add the
a-
three-wheel
I'm sorry.
vehicle or less?
Comment on extending?
No, actually, I just had a quick
Talk about
question
it. Sure,
on
okay.
Forrest's amendment.
Yeah, please.
If the property is sold, does the no-car covenant transfer to the next owner or automatically?
Yes, it would run with the property.
Is that right, Dean?
But if the tenant moves out, you wouldn't want it. Right, because if there's a new tenant, there should be a new.
Right, but then you'd have to build an additional parking spot, right? I mean, the purpose of this is to get you.
Every new tenant would need a new agreement.
Right. Well, no, I think that's right.
If I might.
Name party.
Yes, but
Okay.
then don't we end up having some bizarrely almost title-driven restriction on the property? Because the building is built, the parking is what it is.
So through the chair, if in the case where the traffic director or the director in Forrest Dunbar's amendment makes a determination that a no car covenant is acceptable, that no car covenant would have to be honored by the new owner. If so, you have somebody living in your ADU that's party to the covenant. If you have the primary owner in the main house, they sell the property. Forrest moves in. Forrest needs to either continue that covenant with that person, or his ADU potentially would no longer be conforming. More than likely, you'd have to seek some sort of. Well, I don't even know. That's not really.
It's gonna go on the title.
Determination.
This has gotta go on the title. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
So should it
You
just
couldn't
be
get a-
saying that
couldn't
the
apply for a
title
variance?
not be between the tenant and the, I mean, should it just be that they're going to go into a
It's gonna be a
pact?
huge
and
problem.
it's use?
It's both.
It's too far
How does this
weeds.
affect the leasing or renting of the ADU? I mean, I would imagine that if you have a no-car covenant, it would affect the number of people or the
Yeah,
potential.
but that I don't mind so much, right? Because that's just a market force. But the fact is, if you're creating a building that has a structural limitation, that it has less parking, and that is a function of, that's required of the operation of this entity as permitted, then that becomes a de facto title restriction. And that in fact should be put onto the title, because the title companies need to be able to search that. A buyer needs to know that up front when they go to buy that property on resale.
Where do the current affidavits go their affidavits is required, they go on the title?
Yeah, if they ever come against.
Okay.
It has to be recorded. Yeah.
So this would be recorded and come up in front of.
Which is separate from the tenant issue. Michelle.
You
Okay.
could also provide a clause that says that in order for this construction to be approved, that you have to provide an alternative area to put that parking space in if you ever need it in the future. a lot of times when you ask the traffic engineer for parking reduction, you have to demonstrate that in the case that that parking reduction results in off-site impact or if you need it, that you have the space to provide that parking at a later time if needed. That could be part of this, and then if they wanted to change it and go into another agreement with another tenant, or if there's a spillover, so maybe the tenant doesn't have a car, but the tenant may have guests that have a car. And so it could be a problem. So you may want to reserve that space just in case there's a problem.
Which goes then, that's actually going to kill the opportunity because you aren't going to be able to do that functionally and meet all the setbacks and the restrictions and all the variables. And so we have to contemplate this a little more deeply because there are some permanent ramifications of this question.
Okay, Amy has something to
Well,
contemplate.
my question is, if I have a home and I have a 2-car garage, and then I decide I'm going to build an ADU, and I'm going to say, I don't have enough for parking or whatever, but what if I only have 1 car and I have plenty of parking for my tenant? What if?
Current parking restrictions.
Well, that's it. My tenant, the current owner of the primary home may have plenty of parking.
So I'll defer to Dave on this, to the chair, I'll defer to Dave on this, but I think you're gonna bump up against the required parking for the primary residence first and foremost. And the traffic engineer will look at that and will say no.
John, we don't have enough people in
the
code
traffic
enforcement
engineer, we
to
bump up
operate
against
this.
them all the time. But
Nor will I ever.
realistically,
Functionally, it's
realistically, it could happen. I mean, you have people, thinking about their homes, oftentimes you have a 2-car garage or a 3-car garage. Maybe they don't use all of them.
So the one way that it could work, and now I'm veering way off into Brian's territory, is if you had a 2-car garage that you somehow walled so that each now became an individual parking stall, and one of those parking stalls could count towards the parking requirement for the accessory structure.
And that could be done by agreement, though. That's the kind of thing that the traffic engineer could say, I approve of this because, look, there are enough spots if this is done in this way.
They can today through the changes as proposed.
Right, and so with this amendment, though, you are creating a permanent change to the land. And that's where you run into the challenge. Because once the building is built, you're never going back.
But the alternative, right, in some of these cases, is they just don't build an ADU.
And that argues for, and I know my neighbors in South Edition would choke me for saying this, but
Then don't say it,
lower
Chris.
the parking restrictions, right? Or come up with a more flexible tool that allows for agreements with neighbors, that allows for lots in the area to be utilized in other ways. But we're not there at this conversation.
Well, through the chair, the code changes that we've presented, in particularly the portion around parking and potential for parking reductions, resides with the traffic engineer to evaluate. When the traffic engineer evaluates parking reductions of any kind, they are taking into account the existing conditions of the property in question and the surrounding area. So if, for example, in North Star, in Tin Steele's neighborhood, if you're trying to build an ADU and you can't meet the parking requirement on site, there is on-street parking. There's also municipal parking directly abutting that North Star neighborhood that maybe the traffic engineer would sign off on because you can park in those spots 24 hours. So I only throw that out to say that there's a lot of flexibility built into the code provisions that we put forward to try and accommodate people's cars and motorcycles. And we've left that up to the smarter people than us upstairs in traffic.
Okay, anything? Dean, you had a comment?
I was just going to mention that the end of this paragraph says it has to be recorded in the office of the district recorder will be in the chain of title, like an easement is recorded separately from the actual deed. So that will ensure that it shows up on any type of search.
Yeah, but the covenant isn't between the tenant and the landlord. The covenant is between the property owner, and it should be between the property owner and the municipality.
Well, I think the effect is it restricts the property use, in some way it's covenant, and it will force that agreement between the tenant and the owner to, well, the owner's responsible to make sure the covenant's complied with, so the owner's got to make sure the tenant complies with that. Right. It would be a responsible owner that makes it a term of any original agreement.
That would be a covenant between the city and the landowner or the property owner, and then a term of lease with the tenant and the landlord. And so there's a functional difference there. Covenant is pretty heavy restriction.
So through the chair, I'll add one last comment that I think there's a lot of complications with this, but I do also want to point out that there could be situations where the landowner agrees to this approach, enters into the covenant, and even if they sell the property, the person who buys the property after that owner willingly buys it knowing that they have this covenant in place, and they're fine with that. A lot of us buy homes in this town knowing that they have certain strings attached, and we're fine with it.
As long as it's recorded.
But John, who enforces the covenant? What department of the city would enforce the covenant?
Municipality does not enforce covenants.
Yeah.
I know, that's what I'm trying to say. We hear the word covenant, but who enforces it?
It doesn't matter if it's an affidavit, if it's a CC or a covenant code or restriction specific to a piece of property or to a neighborhood, the municipality doesn't enforce it. That would be up to the association. Municipality enforces Title 21.
Yes, but if you're not part of an association, you're just a single family, then in effect, nobody will enforce it.
Well, in this regard, because there is a requirement, because it's actually written in the code, then we could enforce on the code. We can't enforce on the covenant. So there's some nuance there that
But how many people do it in Jack Frost's office? I mean, you're adding things city can't possibly do. Sorry.
Well, this
Anyway.
would have to be disclosed if somebody was going to sell a property that had this on there.
It's recorded.
Michelle?
Just the, so this is, two things would probably actually be recorded because the reference to the traffic engineer approving the parking reduction. So there would be the agreement that's approved by the director.
Right.
And the second thing that's going to be approved is a parking reduction of the traffic engineer, which also gets recorded. And I think that's your enforcement tool, as long as it would be in a complaint.
I don't know if that's the way that this is written, Michelle. I think that you can reduce the parking requirement and allow for the engineer, the traffic engineer to provide on-street parking. Or if the covenant is recorded, then it takes the traffic engineer out of the picture. So that's by right, as long as you have a covenant. So that's.
So you want to tie them together so that she could. So
I think what Mr. Schutte said, that the proposed language allowing the review by the traffic engineer allows the maximum flexibility to evaluate the situation and use sound engineering judgment to determine whether or not it's reasonable to not require the parking.
The proposed language in the original ordinance or the amendment?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, to be clear, this does not alter that proposed language, it's just additional to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on this? Okay, good. Ooh, great discussion, good thoughts. Appreciate all this. Okay, so we've discussed these. We'll go forward. Just go forward on Tuesday. Make or not make your amendments, and we'll discuss them on the floor. Is that the plan? Okay. So let's go around, and if anyone wants to speak broadly on ADUs, broadly and briefly, we can start with Dan. Dan
We
Holmes.
have 5 minutes for everybody.
We got 5 minutes for everybody. Be polite to the next guy.
I'll be shorter than that. 20 years ago, I was working on this, and the requirement to increase, provide housing for what, 80,000 at that time, 80,000 people? But nowhere did we ever, well, first of all, this is all about neighborhood character. Absolutely, almost every other page about neighborhood character. And nowhere in this ordinance do you have defined when an ADU is going to violate the neighborhood character. You're going to get into trouble, lawsuits, I don't know, it's a mess. You need to define it. And I don't think you can. And nowhere in here did we ever say that the point of accessory dwelling units was to provide more money for the homeowner. And actually, I'm rather appalled that that whereas in this ordinance would go through saying that the point is to make more money for the landowner. I really object to that. And there's no penalty spelled out in this ordinance as to, okay, so if they're in non-conformance after a few years, what are the penalties? Do they tear it down? They have to pay a fine? You need to spell that out. I think this is not ready for Tuesday, frankly. And as far as the need to go from 700 to 900 feet, there's a lot of condos that are 700 feet if you you look in the paper. And the rationale that architects need more room to make something look good and coordinate it with the name structure. Have you looked at the ADUs around? No architect was involved, and I can tell you they probably won't be. But my main point is, if you're going to have ADUs and they only think there's going to be 1,000 or something, you have to have it counted in the calculations for density. If the 2040 plan are all about increasing residential units, then you have to count these, and it's not. It's on page of the original ordinance, 810. It says ADUs are not included in the density calculation of a site. I don't know exactly what that means, but I get the impression that these are not going to be counted towards the density quota for a neighborhood or an area, a sub-area, and it needs to be.
Okay.
That's wrong.
All right, thank you. And actually, I think Mr. Schutte addressed that carefully at our work session, and because of shortage of time, listen to the tape, and it was very clear. Those are separate issues, and it is dealt with in the way that you're concerned about. So, with it is a housing unit. So, next, Cheryl, you came. Anyone else? Brian, more to add?
Just to build on the size restriction, the internal ADUs, if you've got a large hillside home that's say 4,700 square feet and it's got a walkout basement, and you're just reconfiguring some space in the basement, it doesn't change anything from the outside appearance, and then to be restricted to 700 or 900 square feet, when most 1 or 2 bedroom apartments for rent in that area are probably going to be more on the order of 1,000, 1,200. I worry about people that already have those in existence who are going to come in and want to apply for a permit and be in compliance and be told no, 1,200 is unacceptable. You have to completely remodel this in order. So you're going to kind of, with that size restriction, limit the market and limit compliance, so to speak. There'll still be some black market ADUs out there. So in the case where it's, or in what Tyler said, if you're going to build a 35 by 35 detached garage, it makes sense to have that second story 35 by 35 available for living area, not to put up a partition wall and have a bunch of wasted space just to meet some arbitrary size requirement. So there's some balance there. I think that we'd love to have available to us, some flexibility in that. That's all I add right now.
1 minute.
Tyler, you got a minute.
You know, things change. Our households have changed. We built the majority of housing units in this town for either our traditional view of a family household, which are by and large the minority of households in Anchorage now, or for pipeline workers. And I would sort of tell you that who we need to be thinking about building housing for is very different today than it was in 2080 or 1980 or 2000 even. So we need to think about a retiree, single person, or an empty nester, or a millennial, household sizes. I don't think you're getting, I live in a 5-bedroom house. I don't believe that is the norm moving forward. By and large, or most people, most households in Anchorage are 1- and 2-person households, and that trend will continue in the future.
Very good. Appreciate that. You guys have anything?
I just wanted to ask, because we talked about long-term versus short-term rental of these.
What would be the
Because I
issue?
know, like, why I have heard, I don't know if I can point to anything specifically, but I think that I've heard about neighborhoods having issues with like Airbnb rentals popping up versus more long-term rentals, and I think that also kind of ties into allowances for dimensions and height too, is whether if you're providing a space that people feel like they can live in long-term, that might be more appealing than short-term weekend rentals for people who are visiting. And I just don't know if that's what you guys talked about. Yeah.
So you're thinking that people are going to build an ADU to rent it out to, wow, I hadn't thought of that.
You can make, I mean, I think in a lot of ways people think that they can make more money charging high rates for weekend rentals than
It's a big issue in Hawaii right now.
And Birdwood.
Really? And Goodwood, you're right.
Except on the main island.
Miss Manning? Thank you.
The big island.
Getting bigger all the time.
My concern is, first of all, I hear from the Assembly really interested in passing these ordinance, but I don't know if we are really ready. What I hear it is that it is a relationship to what is proposed between whoever wants to build an ADU and the city. The neighbor is left completely, is ignored, and I think we should have a voice. Because you are transforming an R1 to R2 without consideration of the neighbor. This is a blanket from all over the city, and the difference are great. So I live in an old neighborhood in West Anchorage, in Huntington Park, and I gave my comments to the Trinidad Community Council that passed them to you, but I hear that Community Council don't have much of a weight in your decision, which is regrettable in part. And so I want you to give the time to have the neighbors who have paid taxes on RU for years and years to be respected in the need and the intent. I understand there was a concern in the meeting about having to pay up to $6,000 for a permit for an ADU. But, you know, you ask yourself how much the neighboring property are going to be devaluated by the additional traffic, additional parking, additional people, density, shade, you name it. I think that not the same consideration has been given to the old city, only to the people interested in developing an ADU. And, you know, possibly I'm going to experience that personally, to be there to you, not on my property, on my daughter's property, because I'm getting old. That's the reality of the new needs. But beside that, I cannot defend the personal interest. You need to defend the old city, take care of the old city. So please give us the time to consider that.
All right.
And I want to make only a comment on one of the communities being touted as a success is Waco, Texas, and by accident, I happened to go to Waco, Texas a couple of years ago, which is absolutely not comparable to Anchorage in any way. There are a number of universities that I went when my grandchildren attended university there, and you can find a situation that really I never thought could be found in the city. It's called the city. Some high rise, and then you get expanses of places like the old Native Hospital in the area down in Second Avenue. So, I mean, let's not apply the same rubber stamp to everything. Please consider the rest of the neighborhood. Do I hear that they could have any attention to them? There is any hope?
All right, thank you. Anyone else knowing that you can speak on Tuesday for 3 whole minutes? Mr. Porter?
I just think that the city is changing, the population is changing, and our demographics are changing, so I think that, we need to consider changing. I understand the feelings on both sides, but the proposed rules here, as I see them, don't violate the underlying rules of lot setback and all those other restrictions. So I think we just need to consider that if we're going to grow as a city and stay in control, which we're not in a lot of areas, that this kind of change makes a great deal of sense.
All right, thank you.
Move to adjourn.
Anyone else? All right, thank you.